Well, we're looking at Abraham this morning, and I was hoping for some children to help me. I was expecting some children to help me. Yeah, so I was going to get them to act out different bits as we went through, but there we are. We're going for what we've got. So if you turn to the back page of your sheet, you'll see a little map there, and I'm just going to give you a quick outline of Abraham and Sarah's life. And there's a number of things I just want to highlight. You know I like alliteration. You'll notice that every point on here starts with a letter L. Okay? There's a lot of points, but they start with a letter L, so hopefully that helps. Right, the first thing is this, is Abraham and Sarah were people who listened to God. It's interesting, if you look at the story, which runs from Genesis 12 through to Genesis 25, to tell about 14 chapters in Genesis which relates to them. And 7 times, or 7 occurrences rather, it says God said to Abraham. 7 occurrences, sometimes it's within one passage, it's a number of occasions. But 7 different occasions it says God spoke to Abraham and said whatever he said. And then also another 3 occasions God appears to Abraham. A couple of times in a vision, and another time he appears to him face to face. And I think the first thing I want to pick up from Abraham really is about that listening to God, that connection with God. And that fact that he was then ready to be obedient. You know, listening is more than just hearing, isn't it? Listening is actually taking hold of what God says to us and being obedient to it. Now, I don't expect, I'll put it this way, okay? I only have a daily relationship with God, which I'm convinced Abraham had. I'm convinced he spent time meditating on God day by day. But there were certain occasions in his life when God broke in and spoke in a very special way. And that's the 7 occasions I talked about, plus the 3 visions. And that was spread over a period of about 70 years. So it would appear that Abraham first had a communication from God in a very amazing way when he was about 70, on that way. And it seemed to finish when he was about 140. Okay? So sometimes you can feel like God's not saying much, but actually be ready. Be ready to listen for when God speaks to you. The second element about Abraham's life is this, that he lived under God's promise. We're going to do this, okay? I'm coming prepared to be slightly more childish than sometimes you are. And wave a banner for me. Okay, I don't need all the stuff to be honest. Yeah, who's up for waving a banner? Excellent, Ali. Oh, I didn't anticipate my sellotape gets sticky. Have a banner of the nation. Helen, have a banner. Faye. And who else is up for one? There's a few of these, okay? You pass that back, Andrea. And then there's a blessing to all for Vanessa. That's all Jill there. And then I think Jill had her hand up as well. So let's... there we go. There's a blessing for blessed for Jill. And there's land for Andrea. So here's the thing, hold the banners high, yeah? Because actually, it's like waving a banner, okay? When you're under a banner, you know, when they went into battle and things, and actually it was a symbol of who they were and what they were doing, and where they belonged. And actually, God speaks these promises into Abraham's life. He says, you're going to be famous, you're going to be well known throughout the earth. You're going to produce a nation through you. There's going to be descendants, and you're going to produce a nation. You're going to have land, God says to Abraham, okay, the promised land of Israel. You're going to be blessed, as Jill's waving there, okay? And I'm going to bless you in many ways. And we see that through Abraham's life, the blessing that comes. And then, as Vanessa's waving there, is that blessing to everybody. And there's a big question. Do you prefer to be blessed or to be a blessing to others? This is the question to think about, okay? And one of the great promises that Abraham had was to be a blessing to the whole world. And of course we know that happened ultimately through Jesus Christ. Thank you very much, and carry on waving them if you like. But here's the thing, is that Abraham lived under those promises day by day. Yeah? His life was directed by the promises of God. And so I think our call this morning is to live as well under those promises of God. Let's wave them above ourselves, so to speak, day by day. and live in the light of them. Next, he left home to obey. He went wandering, he became a nomad, basically. And you can see there, the map above, there's a red line which starts the sort of middle right at There's a pink line just above it, which is highlighting a general trade route. And so Abraham left with his family, in fact with his father, Terah, and they left and headed up, which is down in Iraq, okay, and headed up through much of the Middle East, through Syria, up to Haran, which you can see up in the top centre there, where he stayed for a time. And there God spoke to Abraham again and said, basically, get down to Canaan. That's where I want you to be. So he left Haran, which is in what's modern sort of Kurd type territory, really, on the borders of Turkey and Iraq and Syria, Turkey and Syria. And he headed down into Canaan. Now that very much meant leaving civilization. So it was kind of moving from Iraq was like moving from a big city like London, let's say, to move to Haran was like moving to a country town, a bit like Telford or something. Yeah, it's considered a bit not so a bit inferior. We're considered to London, aren't we? Of course, in our minds, of course, we're better. We're considered a little lower down. But then he moved not only from the country town, but right out into the middle of nowhere, really, where there weren't major towns or cities at all. It was all just camping. Yeah. So he left home. Next item is this: is he had life issues on the way. Now, living under those promises of God, yeah, doesn't mean we don't have any issues in life. You know that full well, yeah. But we have to keep declaring those promises, keep those promises waving, so to speak. The first problem that he and Sarah had was they were promised a nation and descendants, but actually they had no children. The second problem they had was strife. And the first occurrence of strife in their life, you remember that Lot, he has his nephew with him, okay? Abraham's looking after Lot, his nephew, and it ends up that there's a strife between their people over resources. Who can access the land and let their animals feed and such like. And so they end up separating. So there's that strife which Abraham needs to deal with in his family. Another strife is between Hagar and Sarah, so his wife, and Hagar, who's his wife's maid, and there ends up strife there as well, which he also needs to deal with. And then later on, he ends up with strife in the family between his two sons, between Isaac and Ishmael, which he also needs to resolve in particular ways, yeah? So we see this strife coming through in multiple ways. The next problem he has is neighbours, yeah? I don't know if any of you have problems with neighbours, but he was using a certain well, and some of the neighbours came and started using the well instead of him. So he had to sort that little problem out as well. Then actually about 40 years before he died, Sarah died. So there was quite a long period of mourning for him and the loss of Sarah. And then lastly, he was ripped off. So he wanted to buy a little bit of land to bury his wife, and the person who sold it charged a very high price for the bit of land. So he was ripped off in that sense. So there's all sorts of issues we can face in life. Next thing about it is low times. And I was going to have the kids just put their heads in the hands for this, you know. I don't know about you, whether you've had some low times just recently, where it's just like, oh, I'm so struggling with life. Life is really difficult, and we can be tempted in those times to start to doubt. And that happened for him. In fact, what happened for Abraham is that doubt caused him to take his own initiative on 3 separate occasions. Twice, he headed towards Egypt and persuaded people that actually Sarah was his sister. He was afraid that she would end up, he'd end up being killed for it, basically. And so he ended up telling lies in order to take his own initiative, in order to try and protect himself. Another time, of course, he slept with Hagar in order to produce the son that he was promised, which of course was not the son of promise at all, but it was something of his own initiative. So sometimes in those low times, we might be tempted to take our own initiative. And then there's the call to love others. He loved others. I noticed that most particularly with Lot. I mean, Lot didn't seem to do him many favours at all, in all honesty. but he kept loving him and caring for him. What he did with Lot was he let him choose the best plot of land to go to provide for his flocks. What he ended with Lot got himself into trouble, and basically ended up with a battle and he got carried away, and Abraham went out of his way, a long way out of his way, risking his own life and the life of his own men, to rescue him and get him back out of that trouble and back into a peaceful situation again. And then also, he spent quite a bit of time in conversation with God, interceding for Lot, praying for him, praying for his safety, which you know in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Then he's a guy who laid down his hopes and dreams as well. So, if you like, the whole meaning of his life was centred in his son Isaac, who was to be the descendant who would produce the nation and the blessing to all and everything else. The promises of God's kind of centred in Isaac. Yet he was ready to lay down Isaac's life on the altar in obedience to God, in sacrificing his very hopes and dreams. And then lastly, he left a legacy. Abraham left a legacy. There are two legacies. One was his son, Isaac, who continued to know God and to experience God and carried on that faith into future generations. But also there was the patch of land. So he bought this patch of land. It might have been ripped off for it, but this patch of land was kind of a symbol of the fact that Israel would ultimately return to the country of Israel. So there's that legacy there as well. So that's a very quick overview of Abraham's life. Okay, what he was like, what he got up to, how he behaved, how he thought about things, how he interacted with God. And I might encourage you to read some of the accounts which are there in Genesis 12 to 25 to brush up on what you know on that basis.